Okay, so my TrimUI Brick is finally here, and today we're going to find out if this is a good contender to replace your Miyoo Mini, Miyoo Mini Plus, RG35XX Plus, whatever it is that's your favorite pocket handheld. We're going to find out if this sets the new standard for that category, so let's dive right in. I will say that one thing TrimUI always has going for them is packaging and overall finish quality is usually maybe a step above what Anbernic or Miyoo offers, so that's always a nice thing to see. So without further ado, let's open this up and see what's inside. You've got your usual stuff. We've got our instruction manual here, which does come in English with a variety of instructions, so we might refer to that later. In our standard packaging materials, I've been asked for the return of ASMR to the channel. And there it is, the TrimUI Brick. Of course, we get our standard USB cable, and I've already actually opened this before, so they're loose, but originally these little spare bumpers are something that are in their own little sealed packages, which is interesting because, well, I'm just gonna tell you right now, the TrimUI comes with 3 optional sets of bumpers. These are not the first ones that were installed, but probably the ones I like the most, which is kind of this mountain type thing. And then we've got a set that is a bit more curved, and then we've got a set that's a bit more flat with a ridge, which was on it out of the package. So let me just show you a close-up of what that looks like, and we'll try them all on here and see. And then here is the more curved one. But what was funny about my package, see if you can figure out, that's right, they sent me 2 R2 and no L2, so I don't actually have a complete set of buttons for the rounded ones, which is kind of annoying. But let me just show you what those all look like. So these just slide right off, and they kind of have a little cross key like you might see on a mechanical keyboard. And then you just pop on your desired. I'm actually going to put the R2 on here instead of the L2, so it looks a little bit weird, but that's kind of your more curved, so I guess that's a little bit more comfortable, although that didn't end up being my favorite. And then here we have the ones that were on it when I first took it out of the box. And these ones have a nice little ridge and they're pretty flat, but by far my favorite so far, I think, are these mountain range, I don't know what you want to call them, because they give you a nice slope up feeling when you're holding the handheld. So I'm just going to pop those back on. Careful when you pry these off. I had one go flying across the room while I was doing this before. And here you have it. This is the Brick. I will say that my initial impressions when I first opened this up out of the box is that the plastic does feel a notch above some of the other contenders. It feels nice. I think this panel is actually metal here on the top. And then you'll notice that unlike some of the other ones, there's really no slope. It's just flat. I guess to its namesake, it truly is a brick. And it's very squared off here. But you know, it kind of does give you those analog pocket vibes right out of the box, just that sleek and sophisticated kind of look. So I do think that for styling, they did kind of nail it here, but we'll talk about whether that's actually comfortable or not later in the video. Okay, as far as specs go, the biggest highlight of this device is definitely the screen. It's 3.2 inches, but it is 1024 by 768. So we get a big bump on pixels per inch compared to something like the standard 640 by 480 3.5 inch screen that you've seen in many handhelds, such as the Miyoo series and all of the Anbernic RG35XX HVSP, whatever, 2024 plus, however many stupid device names that they came up with this year. But yeah, so excellent screen, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. We've got the all-winner A133 Plus, which I believe is the same chip that we saw in the TrimUI Smart Pro. So with that chip, we do get a little bit more power than what we see out of the H700 in the various XX Anbernic releases and the Miyoo Mini and Plus releases. So I don't think that really matters a whole lot for the systems you're going to play on here, but it does have a little bit more overhead, so can't really complain about more power. We've got some pretty nifty LEDs on this one. Okay, so I turned off the light here so I could show off one of the specs that they like to advertise. I don't know if I'd really call it a spec, but it does have these kind of cool LEDs. And with the default system, they kind of change color depending on which console you pick. And we also see those LEDs here on our trigger buttons and this little bar on the top here. So that's kind of cool to see those different colors as you scroll through your game collection. I mean, I'm not a big RGB person. If you've seen my reviews before, you know I always turn it off around the joysticks and stuff, but still, it's kind of a neat little feature if you are into that kind of thing. Now with the lights back on, as far as the rest of the specs, we do have a 3000 milliamp hour battery on the device, and I think that covers the main things As far as what it comes with, you can get no card or various card sizes, depends on the reseller and depends on where you're getting it from. I always recommend no card. So I was sent this unit today by ToRetro.com. A big shout out, big thanks to them for providing this unit to me for review. Check out their site. They sell a lot of awesome handhelds, Anbernic, TrimUI, all of the popular ones you know and love. And if you're not keen on ordering somewhere like AliExpress where you're not sure about the experience and sometimes you might get a bag with keychains instead of a TrimUI brick, ask me about this because that actually happened to me. So really glad that I got this one from ToRetro, and they do provide some pre-set up card options. Use code BaseDerek to get 10% off your order, or follow the links down in the description to find the TrimUI. I think they might actually have a Christmas code right now that's better than my code, so use that one that's displayed on the site if it's better for you. Either way, I'll drop a link to their site and to this particular handheld down in the description so you can pick one up if you decide that you want to get one after watching this review. They aren't seeing the video before this is being published, and they didn't send me any money, just the handheld, so still my honest opinions in this review. They are not censoring it. They're not telling me what I can and can't say about this. So again, big shout out, thanks to ToRetro.com for sending me this unit for review today. Now, personally, if I was going to order this, I would get the no game card and do my own SD card. There's already kind of the morality question of getting the game card versus sourcing your own ROMs, but also the cards that come with it aren't always perfect, and I'll dive into that a little bit when we go through the software on here, that I did encounter some weird things while I was using the unit. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The device currently comes in the black as shown here and a white model. You can see that there are pictures and advertisements for the red and purple model on all of the websites where you can order this. But my understanding right now is that those models were only going to be produced if there was significant demand for the original white and black. I think they're happening. I know people that have ordered those colors though, and they haven't seen any shipping notification no matter where they ordered it. So something to think about. Maybe if I was you, I would wait until those colors are actually shipping before ordering them. Personally, I think the purple and the red both look really cool, but if I had ordered one of those, you wouldn't be seeing a review right now. So I'm glad that I got sent this black one for today's review. Okay, now that we have all the basics out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look and just do a quick tour of the device. So nothing of note on the top here except the LED bar. However, on the center of the back, I don't know if you could call this the top, it's sort of the middle of the device. In between the triggers here is the USB-C port. And I believe this USB-C port is for OTG. I tried plugging a charger into it and it did not charge, and thankfully I did not fry the device, but I was just curious. And the USB-C port on the bottom is full featured. It can do charging as well as data transfer and some other options. There's some menu settings for that. We've got our micro SD card slot, the reset button, and our headphone jack down here. And on the left side of the device, we've got our volume buttons. And on the right side of the device, we've got the power button and a toggle slider, which can be mapped to various things. And of course, on the front, we've got all our controls and everything. So why not dive right into the controls of the device? Real quick, again, just the finish and feel. I do like it. I do feel that some of these edges can be a little bit too sharp, but we'll talk about that in the ergonomics section after we talk about controls. All right, so for input testing, let's take a look at the controls in the device and how they feel. We'll start on the back with our bumpers here. They are pretty pleasing. They are clicky, but they're not loud clicky. They might be a dome switch rather than a mechanical switch or a membrane, so we get that nice in-between of being tactile without being quite as high-pitched, snappy, clicky like a mouse click that you get out of the micro switches. Of course, the triggers and the bumpers are essentially the same thing in different spots. They're not analog, so don't really have anything to comment about the triggers that's different than the bumpers on here. Start and select is down here at the bottom, and then this is the menu on the left. That kind of can trip you up depending on what you're doing. I think that if you're running something like MinUI, and maybe even on the stock OS with some scripts, there's some stuff going on. In the Retro Handhelds Discord, I was looking at some code that people were pasting to swap these, or to even swap these additional function buttons to be start and select, which I think might make more sense if you use those buttons a lot. But yeah, by default, they are down here on the bottom. And then since I mentioned them, I'll just say again that we've got two function buttons here, and those can be mapped to a variety of things. They aren't anything by default. And then, of course, we've got our face buttons and our D-pad, so let's talk about that. The face buttons have quite a nice click. They're rounded, they're not too sharp. I actually really enjoy the face buttons on this one. They feel very accurate. It's really easy to roll over and hit another button because They are close enough that they're not too close, but they're far enough apart that you can still distinctly press one or the other. And since they're rounded on the edge, it doesn't feel weird to try to pivot over to one. You don't have to just press straight down. You can pivot and still hit it. So I do like the face buttons. This is definitely grade A face buttons for me. And then the D-pad is sort of a mixed bag for me. So it is precise because of those dome switches. It feels pretty good to hit overall, but it kind of has a bit of a sharp edge here, and it's almost ever so slightly, let's see if I can get this on camera, there's a bit of a dish to it. It's not quite flat, so it sticks up more on the edges here, and that combined with kind of not a lot of radius to the corners here means that depending on how you hit the D-pad, like if I go like this is uncomfortable. These hard edges of the corners are digging into the tip of my thumb, which I do not like. Now, if you hold it from the center, you can pivot around, and of course that's comfortable. So if you're gonna do some pivot diagonals, then yeah, holding in the center. But if you're somebody that likes to roll around the outside of the D-pad, it's actually pretty uncomfortable to do that. Now, that said, the directions are very accurate, and there is basically almost too stiff. There is no way to hit the diagonals without intentionally rolling over to the other direction there. You can't just wiggle it and get a diagonal, which if you're trying to go for precise, I'm sure is great. If you're trying to do some more roll movements, the fact that it's stiff there plus those hard corners makes it a little less optimal for those kinds of games. Again, if you put your finger in the center and then just kind of roll it around there, you can get a nice roll, but that's probably not how most people are playing. It feels weird to leave your thumb on it. You're going to press different directions. So doing these kind of moves, not the most comfortable. So I kind of give the D-pad a C+ for that. Like, it'd be an A for accuracy. I like the feel of it, but I just wish that it was more rounded on these corners and a little easier to roll without it being uncomfortable. Maybe that's too harsh, but if you have one, let me know in the comments whether you agree with that assessment or not. So overall, I really do like the accuracy of the inputs on this device. I just wish that the D-pad was a little bit less sharp. So let's move on to talking about how the device feels as a whole, ergonomically speaking. So I think compared to the Miyoo Mini Plus, we have a little bit more of a chin down here, which makes it a little better when you're holding it flat like this. I think it's not uncomfortable to hold it flat against a desk. I think where the problem arises is when you're holding it up like this, you have to really rest the bottom of the device on your finger here, or else it's just going to slip down. Because let me show you something here. If we grab the RG35XX, this is the original one, just for sake of comparison, we've got this little rounded edge that goes up here. And there's a good reason for that, because when you're holding it with your fingers, it rests on your finger like that, and then you hit your triggers with this other finger. It allows you to support the weight of the device without it slipping down. With the brick, you try to do that, and the whole thing's just going to drop out of your hands down below. You'd have to pinch it to get it to not drop, and you can't really pinch it and hit buttons at the same time. So yeah, again, you're left putting your fingers down here and resting on it. Now, it's not very heavy, so that's not a terrible deal, but if you're playing with a game that uses a lot of bumper and trigger at the same time, then it might actually not be the best. If you're holding it flat like this, though, it's okay. And if you're just using the D-pad and buttons, it's not too bad. I don't know. I like the aesthetic of this being flat, but I think that these little ridges here aren't enough for it to be grippy. There needs to be like a little indent for your finger. So maybe somebody will make a 3D printed case that adds a little bump or a little ridge or something like that you can clip on there to hold it a little bit better. I'm sure the community will come up with something. The other thing is, depending on how you hold it, if you got your thumb here, this corner is not the most rounded, so you're gonna hit it in, you know, if you round your fingers up, it's not a deal, but if you hold them flat, it becomes a little comfortable to have that ridge on your thumb there. And then also talking about ridges, where the back plate here that's metal meets the plastic housing, it's not, I mean, it's flush, but there's still a little bit of a ridge there. And I found that my finger here was like scraping against it, which was not a great feeling. And it kind of took away from the premiumness. So they're very close. It is really good. I love the front. I love the aesthetic. I love how clean it looks. I think this is definitely the best looking small pocketable handheld you can get. I just think that these edges being a little sharp, these edges being a little sharp, not having an indent for your fingers to rest here, and the sharpness of the D-pad just kind of prevent me from making this a 5-star ergonomic handheld. It's still good, it's still great, but I think, you know, the 35XX here might still be more comfortable just because we've got that lip there, and The plastic here is all one piece. It's not two pieces joined, so you don't have a lip to catch your finger on. Yeah, just take that into consideration. It's not really a deal breaker. I'm probably nitpicking it too much, but I just want you guys to know before you pick up this device that there might be a couple discomforting things depending on how you hold the device. The screen also does get a little smudgy here, so let me wipe that off. And since we were just talking about the RG35XX, let's jump over to some device comparisons here. I'm gonna put them right up next to each other. So you can see size-wise that compared to something like 35XX, this is a decent amount smaller. It's not a huge difference. It's not as small as the original Miyoo Mini. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those to compare to today, but it's pretty dang small and it's totally pocketable with no sticks and no protrusion on the back. This thing slips in and out of a pocket really easy, which is definitely one of the pros for me on this device. But yeah, the 35XX is a little bit taller and it's a little bit wider. Granted, it does have a little bit bigger screen, but the screen is lower resolution. I think that the high DPI of the TrimUI almost makes up for that 0.3-inch loss in size. So yeah, just as an idea of what those look like next to each other. Compared to some other small handhelds, here's a RG28XX, which is only a 2.8-inch screen, and it's actually still taller, though of course it is narrower than the Brick, but thickness wise it's sort of in between. It's thinner than this part but thicker than this part. So I think in this kind of case there might be an argument for me to replace the 28XX as my favorite pocket handheld with the Brick, because it's really not that much bigger and the screen is higher resolution and bigger and crisper, so that is pretty cool about it. And these buttons are a little small on the 28XX, so we get a tiny upgrade in size here. Although feel-wise, they're both pretty good. The D-pad on the 28XX is a little more comfortable, but also kind of tiny. Since I happen to have one here, here's the original TrimUI Smart, which is like a 2.4-inch screen, so a big sacrifice in screen size, and it's a little bit less performance. And really, the Brick isn't a huge amount bigger, so unless you're really into horizontal, the Brick probably makes more sense there. And then one last comparison, which doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of the size category, but because it's my favorite sub $100 handheld of the year, I have to bring it into context here, and that's the Cube XX, which you're gonna get a much bigger screen, and it's still very crisp because it's that 720p 1x1 screen. Even in 4:3 content, you can see that the Cube screen will still be bigger, even though you'll have the black bars. So if you don't care about it being perfectly pocketable, I think the Cube XX might still be a better option for many. The D-pad is of course more comfortable altogether. This thing is way more ergonomic than the Brick. So yeah, something to think about if you're in that $70 handheld price range. I would probably recommend the Cube XX if pocketability isn't your main concern. If pocketability is your main concern, then the TrimUI Brick of course wins. It's a big pro to have that nice sleek package. So back to talking about the screen here, let's just zoom in on that. It is super crispy. That is easily the best part of this handheld, hands down, besides the overall look, is the look of the screen. I guess this handheld just wins on looks. The looks of the device, the looks of the screen. So if you're into aesthetic, this might be the handheld for you. So as you can see on screen here, this screen is vivid and it is crispy. I really like the screen. It looks super nice. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the screen in the game testing section, where I'm going to show it versus the 35XX so you can see integer and non-integer what this looks like stacked up. So I'm not going to dwell any more on the screen right now. So let's just hop straight over to audio. The audio is clear enough and there's plenty of treble, but there's definitely zero bass whatsoever. But let's be real, when you've got a pocket little handheld that you're gonna whip out at the park or in line at Costco, do you really need the best audio? You can hear the game sounds if you want them, you can turn it off if you don't want them. And of course we do actually have a headphone jack, so you can always just plug headphones in. I think the audio matters a lot more on the more premium handhelds for me. On these budget handhelds, I can give it a pass that it gets the job done and it sounds pretty clear, but nothing to write home about. So the next thing I want to talk about here is the software. And this section might be a little bit of a rant, it might go a little bit long, but I think that it is important and maybe one of the weaker points of this handheld. So without further ado, let's kind of run through what is going on here and the pros and cons. So the UI is, I guess it's kind of pretty, like it's colorful and it's crisp. I personally prefer a more game and emulator focused UI. So if you jump over to games here, yeah, you've got those icons for the different emulators. If you hit start, you can actually scroll through the sizes. I found that one out on accident. So you can do a bigger one here. I think that kind of looks best with just the big icon. But I think that this is a device that'll really benefit from custom firmware. I still want to talk about what the software is like out of the box, because many people are just going to buy this, maybe buy it with a card, open it up and start playing with it right away. So one thing that I ran into while playing this is that some of the games just don't launch. And another thing that's super weird is that scrolling through these lists of the stock card, like stuff is not in alphabetical order. Like, okay, we got T here. Oh, then there's an A. Now there's an S. I really don't understand the numbering. Again, I wouldn't buy this with an SD card. I would do your own SD card or do custom firmware, but the option is there. I got sent this from ToRetro with the 128 gigabyte card included, so I didn't pick that. So I'm just gonna show you what that looks like. Again, I would buy this without the card and set up your own card so that you know the quality of the ROMs that you've acquired from your personal backups and get those onto the device. The device also arrived in Chinese for me, so I had to go find this second option in system settings, which is language. So if you're getting this for the first time and it's all in Chinese, look for the cog, and then the second option is language. And then once you get to here, I think it'll have English in parentheses and you can choose that here. But yeah, it was a little bit weird to open this up and everything was in Chinese. In fact, there are still some things in Chinese. Like if I go into the apps here, there's stuff that I don't know what these things are, other than guessing based on what they look like. But we do get settings for a lot of things. It's not like the software isn't full featured. It's kind of a lot. It's not necessarily intuitive for the intermediate or beginner user for a handheld. So this, as a first handheld for somebody, I would recommend putting something like MinUI on it, and we'll showcase that. But for an advanced tinkerer, maybe you want to keep this firmware on there. We've got various settings. We change our language. We can do our USB mode for the port at the bottom. I will say that all the graphics are nice and crisp on here. You can go in and do some testing. And then if you go over here to display, you can control all the LEDs. So these are the 3 LEDs for like the function and the top and the back. And you can turn those on and off if you're not an LED person. Change the brightness of the screen. I actually set one of the function keys, this one on the right here, to toggle through brightnesses for me so that I didn't have to jump into a menu to do that. It is kind of annoying that I couldn't find any hotkeys. Usually like a combination of volume and something is brightness, but it didn't seem to do that out of the box. And you've got a lot of display adjustments here. So yeah, certainly a lot of settings to figure out. You can change some theme colors here. I think the default looks the best personally. Connect Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. So jumping back over to what's included on this, I know other creators, I believe, have commented on this. I haven't watched any other review videos in full because I didn't want to alter my perceptions, but I did see some murmuring in various Discord channels about this. And that is that this card comes with ports of current games from current indie developers. We've got ToRetro on here, and that is a big no-no. It's one thing to have ROMs for games that released 40 years ago and you can't buy anywhere anymore. They're backed up from your collection, whatever. Like, it's already a gray area, but I can see where that's not that big of a deal. ToRetro is an indie developer right now developing this game, releasing it, and trying to make money from it on Steam, Google Play Store, other platforms. And we have those source files on the device. Now, a ToRetro port is fine if you buy it on Steam and you copy your files over to here and we're just using a port, that's cool. But here we've got source files, copyrighted source files, pirated source files for the game on the SD card, which I'm not really cool with. I think that really sucks, and we are screwing that developer out of the money that they deserve for making an awesome game here. So I don't know if this is on the reseller or if this is on TrimUI. I don't know if those cards come direct from TrimUI to the reseller and they just repackage them and sell them, or if the reseller themselves is creating the card. So I'm not going to lay this blame on any specific feat because I don't like blaming people unless I know the whole story. But I'm just going to say, resellers, TrimUI, please don't include copyrighted content from modern indie games. That is just not a nice thing to do. So again, another reason why I'm recommending getting this without the card is you should pay your own money for the source files for any of these modern ports, because those developers deserve that. As far as the software goes within the game, we're essentially running RetroArch underneath the hood here. So when you hit the menu button, you're first going to get the simplified TrimUI menu here, which allows you to save, load state, and exit the game. But if you hit advanced menu, this is where you get to RetroArch. I find it very odd that they used the XMB theme by default, because even though this display is high pixel density and crisp, this is some teeny tiny text to go through to find what you want to do. So it is nice that you have the full suite of options under RetroArch, but it's definitely a lot of menu diving here. Again, intimidating for a new user, which is again why I think custom firmware is going to stand out here. Because if you want to change something like integer scaling, then it's like, okay, we got to hop over to settings, we got to go to video, we got to go to scaling, we got to turn integer scale on and off. You know, that's a lot to do, but if you are not familiar with the system. So I've pre-prepared a MinUI card for this, so let's pop that in and see what that looks like. All right, so here's my 128GB Samsung card I set up with MinUI. All right, installing MinUI. Just have to hold on for just a moment here. All right, and here we are in MinUI. Since I preloaded my card with all my ROMs and BIOSes, we should just be ready to go. You'll notice here the LEDs are off. I believe the LEDs in MinUI are hard programmed just to represent if there's low battery, so you don't have control over those colors, but if you're like me and you don't care about RGB that much anyways, that's totally fine. So as you can see, MinUI kind of makes this into a tiny analog pocket. I mean, it's got that finish, it's got that simple UI that kind of borrows from that, so that is cool to see. So yeah, now we just have our ROMs from our personal collection in alphabetical order, and it is super easy to just find what you need to do and jump into that. Other great things about MinUI is you can just tap the power button, it puts the console to sleep, and then after a few minutes, it's gonna put the console off. So you're gonna save a lot of battery because you never have to worry about, oops, did I leave it in sleep mode and forgot to power it off completely. So yeah, here we are at MinUI, and then MinUI, we still got all our regular keys. We've got the menu button here, and we can quickly go into our options. And the cool thing here is you can just go into front end and you can just change your scaling right here. You don't have to menu dive in RetroArch. You've got aspect, which will stretch it to the screen but maintain the ratio, full screen, which will stretch it to fill the whole screen, and then native, which is essentially integer scaling. So if we go back now, you can see that we've got a little bit of a border for integer scaling. Now, I don't think that this device necessarily needs integer scaling. Oh, look, here we go. Menu plus volume up adjusts the brightness the way it should. So yeah, I don't know that you need the integer scaling because of how crisp the screen is, but it's nice that that option is quick and easy to get to. We also have some sharpness effects, so we can do a bilinear filter or a pixel filter, and we can do an effect. So we can do like a grid or a line. So if you want to do that grid effect and make it kind of like an original Game Boy. Let's see if we can actually see what that looks like here. Part of the problem is the screen is so dense that the grid effect isn't super visible just because of how dense it is. It actually looks really good in person, and I think it still looks pretty good on camera here, but it is kind of hard to pick up on the grid effect just because of how dense the screen is. And so you can see here, this is not integer scaled, but if we can, let's see how close we can get here. It still looks super crisp. I mean, yes, there's probably going to be situations where stairs or health bars might look slightly off, but it looks really good non-integer scaled because I think we have like 400 PPI here, so it's not an issue at all. So again, the screen really does take this a notch above some of its competitors. I think personally, I would still replace the 35XX or the Miyoo Mini Plus with this, despite some of the ergonomic cons and D-pad cons I had, just because the screen looks so cool. And with MinUI, this is like the ultimate little premium device. So now that we got MinUI on here, I'm going to pull out the RG35XX, which I have also loaded up with an older version of MinUI. This is a handheld that's not supported anymore because it's older. It is supported for the newer Plus 2024 models, but this is the OG 35XX. I picked this up for super cheap used from a friend, just so that I could use it for some comparisons. This is kind of wibbly wobbly here, so I'm going to put a little prop underneath it so that it lays flat. And let's take a look at the screens and some integer scaling. So instead of a performance testing segment, I'm just going to tell you really quick about performance because I don't think we need to go too deep. For all the 2D systems you want to play, the performance is great. And that's kind of the end of the story. You can play Nintendo 64 on here, but with no joystick and no C buttons and a limited amount of remapping. Yeah, you could do like a hotkey. So you hold down the hotkey and then the D-pad becomes a D-pad instead of a D-pad to joystick, or you hold down a hotkey and these become C buttons. Unless you're really desperate to play those Nintendo 64 games. Sorry, MinUI has aggressive sleep here, which is a good thing for real life and a bad thing for filming videos, but I digress. Yeah, N64 is going to be kind of a subpar experience controls-wise, although it will run just fine on here. You'll notice that Nintendo 64 isn't present on MinUI, and that's an intentional decision by the developer to keep it to the simple systems that run well on the handhelds that this is developed for. We might see extension packs created by developers who will add N64 and other things to MinUI potentially in the future, but for now that's what you get. Personally, I don't think that really matters because this is not the handheld I'm going to whip out when I want to play Nintendo 64. Something like the Cube XX, or even better, the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to make more sense for those 3D systems, I think. We do get Sony PlayStation on the TrimUI Brick, which would be good for JRPGs or other games that you're not going to need the analogs or joysticks for. But again, it's kind of already pushing the limit of what I personally want to play on these kinds of devices. So let's just pull up some common systems. Let's start with GameBoy. We'll do a Game Boy Color game here. I like to do Rayman, that's a fun one. So let's make sure we're on the same thing. So we're gonna go to options on both, front end, and we're at native. So right now we're on integer scaling for both. And this is what integer scaling looks like. As you can see, these are very close, actually. The brick, I think, is almost the same size at integer scaled. It's like a millimeter or two narrower at most, but it is nicely integer scaled. And you can actually tell just from the screen that the RG35XX looks washed out in comparison to the brick. You see how this green is more vivid, this yellowish peachy color is more vivid, the purple is more vivid. All across the board, the colors are punchier on here. Now let's switch over to non-integer scaled and see what that looks like on the respective consoles. And so now you can see that yes, the 35XX now is like another 3 millimeters wider. It's not like a mind-blowing difference. And just getting in close to these, see how well I can show that off. Brick is just a little bit crisper. And I think in terms of the aliasing or weird effects you might see from the non-integer scaling are going to be reduced on the brick because the pixels are smaller and more dense. And yeah, the screen does pop more. So I think personally, if you want to jump up, then maybe you should get like the 40XXV or an RG405M or the RG Cube XX. If you want a larger screen size, then those are options. But when we're talking about pocketable, I honestly don't feel like it's a big difference with the 3.5 versus the 3.2 over here. Let's pull up a system like Super Nintendo here and see what that looks like. Now these games are both set to 4:3, not 8:7, so as you can see, they do fill up the entire screen. And man, you can just see how much more vivid the brick is than the 35XX in this picture. It looks the same in real life. The camera is pretty accurate to what I'm seeing. I've got it dialed in pretty well there. And as you can see here, again, it's marginally bigger, but it's not crazy. So let's turn on integer scaling and see what that looks like on these respective systems. Thank you, Sean, for making MinUI so good and easy to test these. Looks like we got a little bit more of a drop on integer. It becomes a little bit smaller just due to the math for these displays. So yeah, if you're gonna play integer scaled, Super Nintendo is starting to get a little bit small on the brick, but I honestly don't think it's needed. I think it looks just fine at aspect because it is sharp. So here's integer scaled on this one and non-integer on this one, which I would argue you don't need integer on this higher resolution display. So as you can see here, it is bigger on the brick. Now that might be a little misleading because they're on separate settings. So let's just put this back to aspect one more time. And yeah, you can see that it's a little bit bigger. But honestly, after doing this review and playing with this brick for a few days, I think that I will pick the brick for the screen because it is just so crisp and vivid. And I do like the polished look of this console. I wish the D-pad was a little bit less sharp. Maybe we'll see some Sakura retro modding or other button modders get alternate D-pads, 3D printed D-pads that we can put in here. Heck, maybe I'll design one of my own to enhance it. I think we've got a lot of promise with the brick here. So I think that's enough for the game testing. It gives you an idea of how the display stacks up against other similar size class handhelds and how the integer scaling looks and how big the difference between the screen sizes is there. The other thing about TrimUI is that when you hit the power button and it sleeps and then turns off, it saves the state for you and then just resumes it the next time you pop up. So the software experience is just so much better with MinUI in here. If you're at all tech inclined, install MinUI and have a better experience. We're eventually probably going to get CrossMix OS, which will give us some more depth while still improving the stock OS. But personally, I think that I might just stick with MinUI period on here because for small handhelds, it just seems like the right OS. It just makes them super easy to use. It's minimal. There's not a lot of stuff you have to dive into. And the developer's already pre-configured everything in a way that makes sense so that everything looks nice without diving into menus and you don't have to pull your hair out configuring it. Next up, I just want to talk about heat and temperature a little bit. There's no active cooling on here. And so one thing is this is a metal plate here. And right now, it's warm. It's like, I don't know, 90 degrees. 100 degrees. It's not going to burn you. It's not that kind of heat, but it is appreciably warm to the touch. And you saw me doing this review. I didn't play any N64. I didn't try to play any Dreamcast on here. Probably going to get comments in the review that said, why didn't you test PSP? Why didn't you test Dreamcast? Well, you know what? I didn't want to, so deal with it. Anyway, the metal plate here gets warm, and I wasn't even playing high-end systems, so something to consider when you're holding it like this. Your fingers are resting against that plate there, which does get a little bit warm. So yeah, it's kind of not optimal, but it's not a huge deal. Since I've only had this a few days, I don't want to give you false information on the battery, so I'm not going to do in-depth battery testing. I will say that I took some pictures on my phone of the stock UI and how much drained in sleep mode. And so at 7:51 a.m. I was at 76%, and at 2:29 p.m. I was at 73%. So math, 6.5 hours, I lost 3% battery in sleep. Times that by 4 to get 1 day, and you're looking at about 12% per day loss in sleep on the stock UI, which is honestly not that bad. That's like a week or so before it dies, and that's in sleep. That's not powering it off, so just something to consider. Of course, with MinUI, you don't have to worry about that because it powers the device down for you after a few minutes. And yeah, if you're not going to use it for days at a time without worrying about charging, another win for MinUI there. So yeah, not going to spend a ton of time on a wrap up or summary. I've given you my opinions throughout. I will just recap real quick that the D-pad can be a little bit sharp, the edges on the back can be a little bit sharp, but overall it is a very nice and premium finish and feel to the handheld. The screen is the standout feature. That 1024 by 768 3.2-inch panel has got punchy and vivid colors on it. It looks better than something like the RG35XX. If you want to step up to a larger handheld at the same price point, then I would recommend the Cube. This is an ergonomic king, and the 720p display on this is pretty nice. Do keep in mind it's a square aspect ratio, so for 4:3 you're losing a little bit, but this is definitely the comfort king. But I would say that the TrimUI Brick might be the pocket king for 2024, and might actually be able to replace the 35XX or the Miyoo Mini Plus. I don't actually have a Miyoo Mini Plus on hand right now. I've owned a few in the past. I've given them out as a lot as gifts because of Onion OS. They are also available cheaper now if you're going to do a gift, so that's still a relevant handheld. But for somebody that is maybe looking for the most premium pocket experience, the Brick is a super cool option. So I would probably recommend it as long as you are not put off by the cons I talked about. Remember, go to ToRetro.com and use code BaseDerek for 10% off. I'll put links down in the description. And as always, thanks for watching and happy gaming.